The call came in at 3:47 a.m. FBI agents across Florida were mobilizing for simultaneous raids, targeting not drug dealers or organized crime bosses, but corrections officers, men who held the keys to prison cells and the power over thousands of lives. Among them were members of the Ku Klux Klan who had planned the perfect murder. Their target, Warren Williams, a black man whose only crime was standing up to a racist guard. But there was one thing these conspirators didn't know. One of their own had been recording everything for the FBI. The Florida Department of Corrections oversees one of the largest prison systems in America, a sprawling network of concrete fortresses scattered across the state. With over 80,000 inmates and a budget exceeding $4 billion annually, it's a system designed to house society's most dangerous criminals. But what happens when the very people trusted to guard these inmates become the greatest threat of all? Lake Butler Correctional Institution, nestled in the pine forests near Gainesville, would become ground zero for a conspiracy that exposed the darkest corners of American justice. Warren Williams never expected his life to intersect with the Ku Klux Klan. A man struggling with severe anxiety and mental health conditions, Warren found himself serving a 1-year sentence for striking a police officer, a moment of panic that would define the rest of his existence. Behind bars, Warren was vulnerable, isolated, and trying to survive in a system where the color of his skin made him a target. He had no way of knowing that some of the guards watching over him saw him not as a human being in their care, but as prey to be hunted. The confrontation began with something as simple as cigarette smoke. Thomas Driver, a prison guard and member of the Ku Klux Klan, had a habit of deliberately blowing smoke into Warren Williams's face, a small act of cruelty that spoke to a much larger hatred. Day after day, Driver would position himself near Warren, exhaling smoke with calculated malice. For Warren, battling anxiety and claustrophobia behind bars, this harassment became unbearable. When he finally snapped and fought back, Driver decided Warren Williams had to die. What happened next would have been unthinkable to most Americans, but it was business as usual for Thomas Driver. He reached out to his brothers in hate, fellow Ku Klux Klan members who, like him, had infiltrated the corrections system. Charles Newcomb, another prison guard, David Moran, a former correctional officer, and Wayne Williamson, a civilian member of their Twisted Brotherhood. Together, they began planning Warren Williams's execution, scheduled for after his release when he would be most vulnerable, and law enforcement would be least suspicious. But there was a problem with their perfect plan, one that the conspirators never saw coming. Wayne Williamson, the civilian member of their group, had been secretly working with the FBI for months. Every meeting, every phone call, every detail of their murderous plot was being recorded and transmitted directly to federal investigators. As Driver and his accomplices grew bolder in their planning, discussing weapons, locations, and timing, they had no idea they were building their own cases for domestic terrorism charges. As the FBI investigation deepened, a horrifying picture emerged. The Lake Butler prison wasn't just home to a few bad actors. It was a breeding ground for organized hate. The employee parking lots were filled with vehicles displaying Confederate flags and QAnon symbols, visual testaments to the ideological poison that had infected the institution. How many other guards shared Driver's beliefs? How many other inmates had been targeted? The questions multiplied faster than the answers, revealing a systemic problem that went far beyond 4 conspirators. The recordings captured chilling details. The conspirators discussed following Warren Williams after his release, learning his routines, identifying the perfect moment to strike. They talked about weapons. Would it be a shooting made to look like a robbery? A beating that appeared random? The casual way they discussed ending a human life revealed the depth of their dehumanization of Black Americans. Each conversation brought them closer to murder, and brought federal investigators closer to stopping them. As Warren Williams's release date approached, federal agencies launched into action. The Department of Homeland Security had been warning for years about white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement, and this case represented their worst fears realized. FBI surveillance teams shadowed the conspirators while prosecutors prepared domestic terrorism charges. The clock was ticking. Warren would be vulnerable the moment he walked out of prison, and his would-be killers were growing impatient to complete their mission. The raids came swift and simultaneous. At dawn on that March morning, FBI agents arrested Thomas Driver, Charles Newcomb, and David Moran at their respective homes. The would-be killers were caught completely off guard. They had no idea their conspiracy had been compromised from the beginning. As handcuffs clicked shut, a murder plot that could have sparked nationwide outrage was finally stopped. Warren Williams, still unaware of how close he had come to death, was alive because one man chose conscience over conspiracy. In federal court, the conspiracy unraveled completely. Faced with hours of recorded conversations and overwhelming evidence, Driver, Newcomb, and Moran had no choice but to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and hate crime charges. The sentences were severe, years behind bars for men who had sworn to uphold the law but instead chose to pervert it for their own racist agenda. Justice was served, but it came with a haunting realization. If not for one FBI informant, Warren Williams would likely be dead. But the arrests raised more questions than they answered. If 3 corrections officers and 1 former officer could form a KKK murder conspiracy, how many others shared their ideology? The Florida Department of Corrections response was telling. They would investigate allegations on an individual basis. For critics, this piecemeal approach ignored the systemic nature of the problem. With parking lots full of Confederate symbols and a culture that seemed to tolerate racial hatred, individual investigations seemed woefully inadequate. The case vindicated years of warnings from the Department of Homeland Security about white supremacist infiltration of law enforcement. Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas had told employees that violent extremism has no place at DHS. But the Florida case proved the problem extended far beyond federal agencies. White supremacist groups had been encouraging members to seek law enforcement jobs for decades, viewing them as opportunities for weapons training and inside access to intelligence. The strategy was working better than anyone wanted to admit. Throughout the legal proceedings, Warren Williams remained largely unaware of how close he had come to death. Still struggling with severe anxiety and mental health issues, he was trying to rebuild his life after incarceration. The knowledge that prison guards had planned his murder would have been devastating to a man already battling psychological trauma. In many ways, his ignorance was a mercy. He was alive, and that was enough for the investigators who had worked tirelessly to protect him. The case caught the attention of Florida politicians, particularly State Representative Diane Hart of Tampa, who called for FBI investigation into the entire correction system. Governor Ron DeSantis's corrections secretary, Mark Inch, faced mounting pressure to conduct a comprehensive review of personnel. But with the department claiming understaffing crises and budget constraints, critics worried that addressing white supremacist infiltration would take a backseat to operational concerns. The tension between public safety and political priorities had never been more apparent. The Florida conspiracy exposed an uncomfortable truth about American law enforcement. The very people sworn to protect and serve had been infiltrated by those who viewed their badges as weapons in a racial war. From local police departments to federal agencies, The challenge of identifying and removing extremists had become a national security priority. Every good officer now had to confront the possibility that colleagues they trusted might harbor deadly prejudices that could explode into violence at any moment. The prosecution of the prison murder conspiracy sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. Training programs began incorporating domestic terrorism awareness. Background checks became more rigorous, and departments started monitoring social media for signs of extremist ideology. But critics argued these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. The deep-seated racism that made Warren Williams a target for murder couldn't be eliminated through policy changes alone. It required a fundamental shift in law enforcement culture. Warren Williams is alive today because one man chose to do the right thing. Wayne Williamson's decision to work with the FBI saved a life and exposed a conspiracy that could have claimed many more victims. But this case serves as a stark reminder that the battle against hate is far from over. In prisons, police departments, and government agencies across America, the eternal vigilance required to protect democracy continues. The question isn't whether other conspiracies exist. It's whether we'll have the courage to root them out before they can claim their next victim.